thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk today about energy efficiency obligations, white certificates. I'm afraid that today's budget did not extend to simultaneous translation. So if you can't understand my Scottish accent, or if I speak too quickly, wave at me, shout at me, whatever. Thank you. It's a very, very interesting time to be talking about this subject because, as Hans pointed out, it's very worldwide spreading. For example, he talked about Canada. More than half the states in the United States have energy efficiency obligations. In South America, Brazil have done this for over 10 years. Uruguay and Chile are embarking upon it. In Australia, 3 of the states are already doing energy efficiency obligations. And the big discussion there is, should we have a national scheme? India, it's starting in the industrial sector, which makes a lot of sense given their economy. And in Europe, sorry, I missed out, India are active discussion about whether they should introduce their own version of this. And finally, coming back home to the EU, the Energy Efficiency Directive, the impact assessment for that, says that these sort of activities could provide half the energy efficiency savings that we will need on the roadmap to 2050. And yet, in the last few months, I have talked a lot to your Swedish energy agency, and I don't think they're really keen on this, to put it mildly. So we should be in for a very interesting debate today. I look forward to that. First, a word about RAP. What is it? It's a not-for-profit organisation which provides technical and policy assistance to government officials on energy and environmental issues. Originally set up by former energy regulators in the United States who really thought that energy efficiency should have a greater role to play in meeting the energy demand of their citizens. It's now expanded to have people like myself who are energy efficiency enthusiasts and got lots of experience in this. And it's been funded by several philanthropic foundations, very typical American approach, and the US Department of Energy and other international agencies. It's now worldwide with offices in Brussels, in Beijing, and in India. And it's really, I'm delighted to say that the European office really does take a European perspective, because one of these dangers, of course, is that you can have the missionary work type approach. So what do I want to talk about today? Well, why on earth would you ever think about using energy companies to do this? I want to talk about what do I mean by the key principles for energy efficiency obligations, sometimes called white certificates, energy efficiency resource plan, lots of names for them. The key thing is the obligation. Someone has to save energy, not voluntary, obligation. That is what makes all of this work, and I don't mind what you call it, as long as there's a legal obligation there. Talk about what's happened in the EU and recent developments in Europe. Give you a feel for the scale of the activity, because sometimes I don't think you realize just how much is going on this. Then talk about, do energy efficiency obligations work? Do they actually turn down energy demand? And then I'd like to put forward a case for why we believe energy efficiency obligations are a lot more sensible from a consumer perspective and from a national perspective than just raising the price through either energy or carbon taxes. Well, we all know, we've all seen the McKinsey curves. Energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit, but it doesn't happen to the extent that the rational economist would predict, due to well-known barriers to energy efficiency investment. And I think it's a blessing that we don't live in a world where we're all rational economists, because that would be a very dull world, but there we are. What's interesting, though, is there's an immediate barrier I'm sure you've already thought of. Why on earth would you ever want an energy provider to be involved in this? Think of yourself going into someone's home and saying, I'm from your local electricity company, and I want to sell you less electricity. What's the reaction? Ha ha ha, it's a con, you're trying to cheat me, etc., etc. It's not, the first thing you think is, this can't be right. But the point is, as we will see, and Ulrich will show, it can be overcome, that barrier. And then, once you overcome that barrier, there are phenomenal advantages in having skilled technical people. And remember, these have got a lot of technical skills, these sort of organizations, because people and small businesses don't understand exactly what they should be doing to save energy. They know they should be doing something, but what is I should be doing in my home so they can provide expert technical advice? They overcome hassle, which I hope translates. Hassle is the bother of trying to arrange an insulation provider or a heating provider. There's many things you need to do, more than one trade. It's difficult for a householder or a small business to do that. They can do that for you. Lack of capital is often a barrier, particularly for those on low income. And of course, subsidies works wonders. We know that across the world. If people are offered subsidies, they like that. Furthermore, if you think about it, one of the big barriers is the so-called landlord-tenant or split incentives. But if you actually take a loan which is attached to the electricity meter, then you overcome that barrier because the landlord no longer has to be responsible for the investment, and the person that benefits from the energy efficiency measures and the energy savings they bring is actually paying for that. And it also tackles the other problem with owner-occupiers typically say, I'm going to move in a few years. There's no point in me investing a lot of money in energy efficiency because I won't get it back when I sell the house. No one currently values it in today's market. Hopefully that will change. But this way, they only pay for the benefit that they get for the time they stay in the house. So again, another big barrier has been overcome. Now, some parts of the company, particularly those where the market's been liberalised and the energy retailer, the people that send you the bills, they have a close relationship with customers. And finally, I've found in Europe, the world over, indeed, that what happens is people always worry about getting small builders in because they have a cowboy perception of those builders that, oh my goodness, who are they? Can we trust them? Will they still be in business if something goes wrong in a few years' time? Well, we've found in the UK that the workmanship associated with the insulation industry in particular has improved dramatically, and they are very confident that the local or national brand is not going to disappear. So the confidence, trust, all of these sort of things, it can overcome a lot of barriers. Okay. We know that renewable and EU emissions trading scheme, they don't exist because the market wants that. They only exist because governments have intervened in the marketplace. And white certificates, energy efficiency obligations, are no different. There is an obligation on some part of the energy company to save energy. And it's particularly noticeable in the EU that if you look at the small energy users, nothing really happens here in this sector without an obligation on some part of the energy company to save energy in their customers' premises and homes. Now, the open trading of white certificates can allow any party, so not just the obligated energy companies, but installation installers, whoever, ESCOs, can join in, obtain energy saving certificates and trade on the open market. As you will see, this is in principle possible in 2 countries, but in practice it only happens in Italy. So how do they actually work? Well, each retailer or distributor has an obligation to save energy in their customers' homes or premises. The target is usually related to the volume of energy supplied or distributed. And in the case of residential sector, often a proxy of customer numbers is used. There's also financial penalties if you fail to meet the energy saving target. And this is a very great thing for focusing the mind. Now, if you think about large industrial projects, then you can afford to directly measure the before and after performance. It's only a few percent usually of the big capital cost of the investments. If you go to the other extreme and think of households and small businesses, there's no way that you can afford to measure every single house. You have to have a simpler way, otherwise you'll spend all your money measuring and not actually doing energy efficiency. And the way this is done is to use the technique known as deemed or ex-ante savings. In other words, you define a series of measures for which you know there are well-established and independently established energy-saving values. Then it becomes very simple to monitor and verify it. It becomes a measure count. The administrator of the program gets a list of addresses where insulation measures are supposed to have been carried out. It does a random audit, picks them at random, phones them up and says, did you get insulation done by British Gas, da-da-da-da-da. It's like a financial dip check. So it's a common audit technique, and it allows you to have confidence in the savings are being attained. What costs are involved and who pays? I suspect you've already guessed ahead and thought, I bet it's the consumer that pays, and yes, you would be right. Let's see what the various steps that have to be funded. First of all, and this is the biggest cost, is the cost of the energy efficiency measures. So who pays for that? Well, the provider gives subsidies. The end customers, and then those are the two biggest sources of funds, basically the energy companies and the end users, and landlords, charities, manufacturers, etc. A range of people. But of course, there are also the costs of the energy company to provide marketing, sales, reporting, planning, etc. And in Britain, we estimate that it's about 18% of their direct costs. Those are the real two big costs, those two. Of course, the administrator, which in the case of Britain, is the auditing and verifying of energy-saving projects and to make sure the target's met. Ofgem carries this out, and it's less than 1% of the energy supplier costs. It's very small. That's because we do deemed energy savings. But even where they don't, it's still not a major cost. And final cost is for government setting the targets every 3 years and carrying out research to make sure that the energy savings remain valid. Technologies improve. Markets are rapidly moving in the appliance and the information and communications technology sector, so you'd have to continually keep looking at those. How are these costs passed through to the end user? Well, if it's an obligation on an energy retailer in a liberalised market, then the obligations are a cost of doing business. They're simply like all the other environmental and indeed health and safety requirements that are put on the energy retailer. And so they're passed on in a way that's not transparent, admittedly, to the end customers. If the obligation is on a regulated part of an energy company, in Denmark it's on the distributor, then it's allowed for in the regulated distribution price control. If it's in the retail price is still regulated, then it would be in a regulated tariff. In fact, there's only one example which breaks the rule, which is France, where the regulator has refused to allow the French EDF and GDF to have an allowance, but that's France. So in effect, the polluter pays principle works. It's not the energy companies. The energy companies are polluting on our behalf. They're emitting the CO2 and all the other environmental things. So we are paying for that. However, and I would stress this very much, the energy-saving benefits alone far exceed the cost to consumers. And when I was trying to get this started in the UK back in 93, 94, I remember trying to think about, I was presenting the information because I wanted the consumers' councils to realise how good this was going to be. And I was showing them net present values and all sorts of things, and the eyes were just glazing over. And afterwards I thought, normal people don't think about net present values. You know, we do because we're immersed in it, but normal people don't. And so I came up with a simple thing which they did understand. I said, for every pound that the energy companies invest, consumers will benefit in the long term by £5. And that's £5 after you've taken off, obviously, the pound that you've paid for because of the company spent it on your behalf, and also any contributions that consumers make to it. I can tell you, last time this was looked at, in the end of 2008, the return was £1 from the utility invested, meant £9 savings to consumer in the long term. Now that is a massive benefit that is not happening. It should be, of course, all the rational economists will tell you it should be happening, but it doesn't happen because of the barriers, and this is a way to overcome it. Oops, sorry. So how are they delivered? Well, most of them are delivered between an obligated party and an energy efficiency market actor through a bilateral contract. Mostly that's how it's done. It's contracted out to the actual installations, not necessarily the marketing and sales, but the actual installations are. And this could be an insulation company, a retailer of appliances, manufacturers, heating installers, etc. Very interestingly, though, in Britain, the energy providers are establishing heating companies, insulation subsidiaries, and microgen. British Gas, which despite its name is also the largest electricity supplier, retailer in Britain, is now one of the biggest installers of photovoltaic panels in Britain, and has always had its own heating company and has started an insulation company. There are similar developments in Italy and in Denmark, you'll hear directly. So the energy service model that I think Hans was talking about is very much starting to happen. As I said earlier, only in Italy and French can you actually have, other than the obligated energy companies, earning white certificates, but only in Italy has there been any significant generation and trading of white certificates. Snapshot in 2011, and I don't think we want to get too hung up on the details here. These are the 5 longest running schemes in Europe. They've all been going for, approaching a decade. Belgium, Flanders, the obligation is distributors. In Britain, it's gas and electricity retailers. Denmark include oil and heat distributions, district heating. In France, they've gone even further, and they've got all energy forms, stationary energy forms, plus the importers of transport fuels, road transport fuels. Eligible customers varies dramatically, residential only. Most people tend to exclude transport. France has got very little, less than 1% activity in transport historically. And then it's usually run by the government or by the regulator. Very different. Everything's different. We've also got developments. Ireland, in wonderfully Irish style, have introduced voluntary energy efficiency obligations. I love that, voluntary obligations. But it'll work in Ireland, believe me, it will work. And they're following the French model, so it's all energy suppliers and the importers of road transport fuel. The Poles have now passed the white certificates, and that should start, I think, next year, and it will cover electricity, gas, and heat providers. The impact is likely to be 1.5% to 2% on energy bills. It's fairly modest. There are alternatives where the energy distributors are basically used as a way to raise money. And this money is then used for energy efficiency. There's a very good and transparent and well-documented program in Portugal, spending about 12 million euros a year, where the energy regulator levies the companies and then invites tenders from anyone to actually deliver it. In fact, the energy companies deliver about half, historically, have delivered about half the energy efficiency obligations, so they're still involved. And finally, there's a much more, well, it's not transparent scheme in Spain. It's been going since about 2004. And I certainly can't find anything, not even in Spanish. Only data I have is about 2007, and all I can say is because it was administered by the regional governments in Spain, 1/3 of the funds had not been spent. So I don't know much about it. But that's an alternative, and that's one of the options that are being considered in the Energy Efficiency Directive. I think as long as that fund is administered by a very clear and transparent process, then I think it might work. But I think the Spanish model is not, I just don't know about the Spanish model, but any evidence I've seen shows it's not delivering in the way, it's not met its targets, let me put it that way. Now, this is my estimate of how much the energy saving. Let's not worry about the middle column. That just tells you everyone has a different metric for saving. Sometimes it's primary energy, sometimes it's delivered energy, sometimes it's you sum 5 years of the primary energy. We've gone to lifetime energy savings of carbon dioxide. And in Denmark, it's first year delivered energy. But even there is now a move, and is also true in Italy, to take advantage of the fact that if you count first year energy savings only, then you are not properly valuing the longer lived measures which go on to save energy for, like insulation, 30 or 40 years. So you're not valuing them, and you finish up with a lot of CFLs, and I'll show you in a minute for Italy, because it's a short-term, quick fix measure, and if you're only valuing 1 year energy saving, what's the point of spending a lot of money on insulation? So both schemes have actually moved now to try and value more the long-lived energy saving measures. The annual spend by companies, my estimate in 2008, for the last data the year I could get data for, is a lot, looks a lot, and I also show it euros per head because my Danish colleagues like to point out that we undervalue Denmark if we only do it in total. And even there, it's 15 euros per head. Sounds a lot, certainly when you're talking about €1 billion in the UK, sounds a lot of money. But even that figure, at that time, was between 3% and 4% of customers' bills. So it's not a major imposition. Worldwide, the spread is usually between 1% and 5%. We're getting close to 5% in the UK now, and we've expanded again. Surprisingly, even though most countries have actually got a total option in what they want to do, most of the activity is in the residential sector. In Flanders, in the UK, it's mandated. There's no choice. That's what you have to do. But in Denmark, France, and Italy, it doesn't necessarily, they don't necessarily have to do that. In France and Italy, they haven't done that. And this is a tribute to the power of the deemed energy savings. It makes administration cheap, and it also reduces risk for the utility. If the utility does this properly, they know they're guaranteed energy savings. If they do it in a process plan, there's an uncertainty about whether they will save it or not. So they trade off these risks. Denmark, and particularly in the Dansk Energy members you'll hear later, to do a lot in industry and commerce, and that's really that's where they started, and that's why they've got such a high percentage figure. Though this has been growing the residential sector in Denmark, and I believe the programme overall is now just gone into the majority of activity is in the residential sector because of deemed energy savings. But again, the diversity within Europe reflects the local conditions. So if you look at where has the energy saving happened, well, in Britain, it's all about insulation. In a sense, we're lucky, if that's the right word, that we have the worst housing stock in Western Europe. So there's plenty of opportunities for us to save through insulation. In Denmark, it's largely been about heating, because they have a lot of district heating as well. In France, it was about energy-efficient boilers. And in Italy, it was CFLs, first-year energy savings in action. But it all varies according to the local circumstances. I've tried to pick out a few examples of the typical annual installations in the energy efficiency obligations. And I've shown the period. So for France, it was nearly 1 million roofs were insulated each year, 1 million roofs, and about 110,000 efficient boilers. Italy, 7 million CFLs, over 3 million low-flow shower heads, again, first-year energy savings, biases towards cheap measures. Wall insulation in Britain, 500,000 a year, more lofts or roof insulation than that. And efficient cold appliances was 1.25 billion in that period. So big numbers. And everyone's been looking at this and saying, are these programs delivering? Are they working at a member state level? And we've increased by 20%. Italy has had an effective 15% increase because they've changed the primary energy conversion factor. France, major step. It's 300% for previously obligated energy providers, factor of 3, and of course, more new players in the road transport sector have been brought in. Denmark's more than doubled its activity, and in Flanders, greater than 30%. Now, the member states don't do this unless they think these are successful programs. This is a very interesting slide from the Italian regulator, which shows, and I've just got out of my mind exactly what all these mean. The TEE is energy efficiency, and it's 1.7 euro cents per kilowatt hour. What they're comparing here is, what is the cost of the energy efficiency compared to the feed-in tariffs that they have in Italy? And so they administer all of these so they know the cost. So this one, that is solar water heating. This is photovoltaics. This is ground geothermal type heating. And I have totally forgotten what that one is, but it's not very, sorry, that one is, but I can't, it's not very cost effective anyway. Tremendous amount of money that the consumers are paying for the renewables compared to what they have to pay for energy efficiency savings. So there's different targets, different end-use sectors covered, different obliged actors, but they all work. It reflects the local status of the energy market, the energy efficiency history of the energy companies, the climate and in the country, the energy saving opportunities, culture, etc. It's very diverse, which is good. Goals have been set fairly low, and they have been achieved in all cases at costs below the policymakers' expectations. The energy companies are now spending around 2 billion a year in 50, and what's more, in 50 operational years' experience in the EU energy efficiency obligations. No company has failed to meet its overall energy saving target. There are not many programs you can say, and that's because of the threat of a fine. And let me give you an example. When France started, they said, okay, we expect it will cost 1 euro cent per, I won't go into detail, but per unit, it will cost about 1 euro cent. In reality, they said, okay, let's set a penalty at twice that. And it came in at 0.4 euro cents, the actual cost. So 20% of the penalty. And that's why it was met. It's a lot easier to do it than pay the penalty. And they've functioned both in liberalised energy markets and also where they target monopolies. Let me move now to a question that's always asked of me. Oh, you always go on and on about all this is good stuff, but does it actually turn down energy demand? Is there any evidence that it actually works? Well, I'm going to use the British data because it's solely focused on residential, and we've had the largest energy efficiency obligation. So if we're going to see it working, it will be working there. And of course, we should look in gas because we're a gas-heated nation. 80% of all heating and hot water is provided by gas. And prior to 2005, the residential gas demand had been increasing in 1 to 2% per year. But in 2005, there were 3 important developments happened which would reduce demand. The energy efficiency obligations doubled, and 72% of delivered energy savings in the obligation come from insulation measures in gas houses. So it's quite significant. Also, we'd been promoting boilers up to 2005 and got the energy efficient or condensing boilers from up to 36% of the market. We'd started at a few percent, so that was quite encouraging. And the government decided, okay, let's just stop mucking about. Every company in the world, in Britain has had a chance to install one. They know what the problems are, trying to swap. Let's regulate. And so they said that all new replacement boilers have got to be energy efficient. And so it quickly moved to 97%. Now that's, given that that saves typically, and about compared to the old boiler, maybe 30% improvement in efficiency, that's a big impact. And finally, the start of the gas price rises, that clearly reduces customer demand. But of course, the government and the Energy Saving Trust and indeed the energy companies had been doing lots on climate change, behavioural change campaigns, and that will also help reduce gas demand. But there were factors going the other way. First of all, between 2004 and 2009, there was an extra 7%, an extra 1.6 million gas customers enrolled. And there was warmer, the period 2004, 5, 6, 7 were pretty similar days in terms of, winter, degree days, but the last 2 years were actually much colder. So whatever the argument is, it's not to do with the fact that there were warmer winters. I haven't corrected the data. Government is trying to do an analysis on all this because it is quite complicated, to be fair, but they're taking a lot of time. And I'll show you in a second something else which is really interesting. So just looking at the raw data, over the period, there's been a 15% fall in gas demand despite an extra 7% households. But that's, as I say, it's a complicated, you need to unpick it. Well, I'm delighted that last year, British Gas, who are not daft, noticed their gas demand per household was dropping dramatically and started to get worried about this. And they looked at the individual gas consumption for 4 million of their customers. So a big statistical sample this is, for the period 2006 to 10. And they looked at all the usual factors, the tenures, the incomes, the temperatures inside and outside, what energy efficiency measures had been installed, what were the changes in behaviour, lifestyles, increased climate change awareness, all of these. And this is what they found. The average household consumption fell by 22%. Average household consumption of these 4 million customers fell by 22%. Now that's not price. That is a mixture of all of these. And they tried to break it down. And it gets a bit more complicated here. But the annual fall was 4.9% compound. They looked at all the big various issues, and I've only quoted here the 2 big numbers, which were reducing. Some of them obviously increased consumption, but the behaviour and lifestyle, very interesting, not what I was expecting, but they believe reduced by 2.7% per year. But the biggest single identifiable factor was energy efficiency, and that was mainly insulation and heating, and that reduced by 3.3%. That, I think, is part of the reason why the chief executive of the group, of which British Gas is part, has said, we believe that in a few years' time, we will be earning more from energy services than from energy supply. Who wants to be a commodity supplier in a declining market? So this is evidence that if you do this and persevere, you can actually make a difference. You can bring down demand. Let me turn to another important aspect. We all know that if we decarbonise energy supply, the expectation is that energy supply costs will rise, especially if you're not going to actually get a lot more energy efficiency happening than is currently the situation. So energy affordability in a low-carbon world is a concern. And it's a particular concern in, obviously, the former accession countries and in the western Europe, where the mild climates have actually resulted in Ireland and Britain and parts of France having an energy poverty or fuel poverty problem. Now, the EU emissions trading scheme increases the cost of energy, and it sends strong price signals to the supply side. But the signals to the demand side are much weaker. For example, in the UK, a 10% increase in electricity prices reduces demand in the residential sector by 2.3%. Now, of course, if your incomes go up, which historically they were until recent times, that's much more important, because a 10% increase in income actually makes the demand increase by 3.4%. And this is what's driven electricity growth in the last 2 decades. Now, we set ourselves the target of thinking about, well, if you do a one-off electricity price rise of 3%, and I chose 3% because it was similar to what we'd actually been expending on energy efficiency obligations, through either a carbon tax or an energy tax, that will reduce electricity demand by 0.69% per year. Good stuff. But what if you actually took that one-off price rise of 3% and reinvested that each year thereafter in energy efficiency measures? You've had the 3% increase, you just ring-fence that and forevermore put it into energy efficiency measures in households. So I used the levelized cost to electricity suppliers in the obligation period 2005 to 8, which was 2 euro cents per kilowatt hour. I used the actual electricity savings obtained by the energy suppliers, which were insulation, lighting, appliances and information technology communication. And I allowed for the fact that the shorter-lived measures wouldn't be still going in 2020, took them out, corrected them, and also corrected for comfort. In GB, you do not get the full savings from insulation you would expect, because our homes are historically quite cold. We take a bit of the energy savings in increased temperatures. Therefore, they don't appear as savings. So it corrected for that. 1.4% was the historic average over the 25 years. And the data shows as follows. The blue line, this line here, is what happens as a result of the price rise alone. And you continue to get this 0.69% per year effect going on in the cumulative energy savings. But if you invest that in energy efficiency, then you finish up 9 times more energy saving than simply doing a price rise. It's not really rocket science. If something only has a 23% impact, and you know something's highly cost effective, and you can get other funding for it, it's not really that rocket science. So it's not surprising cumulatively over the period, it's much, much more effective than just simply having a price rise. So, summing up, despite the wide variation and the way they've been implemented, they've been successful policy tools. This started in vertically integrated, regulated utilities. It's made the transition into liberalised. It's made the transition into LPG and oil. It's made the transition into district heating. And now it's being piloted in France and Ireland on road transport fuels. I don't know about the latter, whether that's the best way to tackle it, but I can tell you the evidence is it's gone through all of that on a worldwide basis, and it's worked. So there must be something good about it. Member states have evaluated their programs and have expanded them all in recent times. What's more, those countries that have them expect at least half their energy savings are going to come from these sort of programs in their targeted areas. We have turned down demand. It can work if you get it big enough, and it's much more effective than a price rise in saving energy. And finally, in today's world, since it avoids member states' government having to use public expenditure to stimulate energy efficiency, it's a really good idea. And the other thing I like about it is that it's not controlled by the government. Government funding, as we know, goes up and down for a whole host of reasons. This, because it's a long-term imposition on the energy companies, is less subject to variation. And if you think about it, we need, if we want the energy suppliers to change their business model, then they need to have some continuity. This isn't just going to be a few years and then it's back to normal. There has to be a vision. This is here to stay. And the energy efficiency industries are not going to invest in their capital in getting better and more production unless they can see there is going to be a real market that's here to stay. None of this will happen without some long-term vision. And I'm sorry to say, in the UK, you've probably seen our feed-in tariffs. The government's been taken to court because they've started to change them quickly. Anything to do with the government is not a guaranteed source of funding. This seems to work better because it's outside the government treasury control. With that, thank you very much for your attention. Do you want me to take questions?
Yes, I think we need a short break, but before that we have some possibilities for questions.
Please.
I can start with one. You know something about Sweden and you have met some guy from the agency. What do you think would be the best argument to introduce this concept in Sweden?
I think the best argument is, why are we so different? And I mean, if the Swedish argument was, well, we've got great building regulations, which you have, and therefore there's not so much scope in buildings as, say, in the UK, and that's true. But then I think to myself, well, hang on, Denmark is a country I know that's got great building regulations. So if Denmark can do it, why would you think that Sweden can't do it? Then I think to myself, hang on, I've got a lot of friends in Sweden, and so I know the 60s and 70s weren't entirely the greatest buildings that were constructed in the world, so there must be an opportunity there. And I know you're doing a lot in heat pumps, and that seems to me great. But unless your market's very different, the efficiency of those heat pumps will be different. Okay? So why do you not want to have a scheme which can encourage, promote, you buy the most energy efficient heat pumps? You don't just put in whatever's the cheapest, because normally not as good buy, but you actually encourage the best performing equipment. So I can think of lots of things that could be done, but I think it depends whether you believe in markets. They're infallible, then it'll all happen. But I'm sorry, it doesn't. We know that, and therefore that would be my argument.
I guess that we have to understand that Sweden is also populated by humans, not by econs.
Other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to know to what extent do taxes and regulation play together. I mean, if the goal is not to increase energy efficiency, basically, but to reduce energy use, and mustn't they be coordinated with regulation and taxation?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. Taxes and regulations, they have a role to play, don't they? And should there be combination approach? Is that right? Yeah. Yes. I mean, taxes do have a role to play. I'm not undermining them. But what I'm trying to say is that a one-off price rise, whether it's tax or whatever reason, unless you invest that in energy efficiency, you are not doing sufficient. So, yeah, price rises are good, whether it be for tax or an energy efficiency tax or whatever. It's good because it does signal the right thing, but it also can be used more effectively. Don't just take it and say, thank you very much, give it to the finance minister, and that's it. That's not a good use. It does not get the energy savings you want. You need to invest that in energy efficiency, which is better for the consumer and therefore, I think, more productive because you get the result you want. That was the point of that slide. I'm not against taxes. We have them in the UK. But I think if you can use those taxes more efficiently by ring-fencing or hypothecating some of that money to be spent in energy efficiency, it makes a really good difference. And it's a tax, effectively, on the end-using consumer when you introduce energy efficiency obligations. There's an amount of money that has to be paid, usually by the consumer.
Right?
Yeah, one question. also seen that it has gotten a real effect on the market value of those properties?
No.
That's an argument for a higher price?
I can only, yes, sorry, yes. Is there any evidence that investing in energy efficiency of property actually increases its value in terms of its sale price? Yeah. The only measure that adds any value to a home in the UK are central heating, which nearly everyone has, and double glazing, which is not, I mean, it's good, don't get me wrong, double glazing, but it's not the best energy efficiency measure. Unfortunately, to date, insulation does not. The fact that you have a condensing boiler, an energy efficient boiler, does not. It's not reflected in the price. It's probably because we have such high price of houses. But that's another story.
Yes, other questions? Please.
I think most of this is related to consumer market. I'm doing an action plan for energy efficiency in Swedish national roads and railways. We have identified some 50 engineering energy efficiency measures. Most of them are in electricity. How would white certificates benefit us in our action plan?
Let me see if I've got your question. You're saying you're interested in how would the white certificates benefit energy. Sorry, can I just see if I've got your question?
Yes, we have an action plan for reducing energy consumption. It's about how the railways are using electricity. It's about how the train companies are using electricity. Various, quite a wide spread of measures. Could white certificates be helpful for us if they exist?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes.
Yes, all right.
Yeah, sorry, repeat the question. The question was, could white certificates be helpful to address energy efficiency improvements in rail transport, which is electrically powered?
Last question, what is the weakest point in this concept?
The weakest point? Probably transparency. Again, it would depend on which country you are, but in Britain, we don't really know the costs that the energy companies are paying. The government is consulting on trying to make that much more transparent in the future so that we can be, say with confidence, exactly how much they're spending on this. That's probably the weakest part in the British system. In the French, well, I mean, every system has a weakness. I'd rather put it, every system has the opportunity to improve.
Thank you, Ian. And 5 minutes break, and then we come back and have an interesting discussion with our Danish colleague. Welcome back.